to organise that. So, on that note, we now turn to that which makes everything possible, which is the financial report from you, Paul.
So no expectations there then. And of course the profession which people really trust is not nursing or indeed medical people, but accountants, because we all need them, he said.
The singing accountant. I see it as a television programme.
I think I better get on with my report.
Use it to our ears.
So the report in front of you sets out the latest financial performance data for the commissioning system and our forecast for the remainder of the year. As this meeting is quite a bit earlier in the month than our normal pattern, we don't yet have the data for November, which will be coming through actually next week, just before I go off for a Merry Christmas break. So this reflects the position as it was at the end of October. There's considerable continuity between what I'm about to take you through and the report that I brought last time we met, back in September, and indeed with the half-year numbers that we published while we didn't have a board meeting last month, in three key respects of continuity. Firstly, the core forecast that you can see for the commissioning sector as a whole remains at break-even, a marginal overspend of 7 million, which is well within the roundings on a budget of 106 billion. Secondly, the report again highlights the reasons why this year is bringing unprecedented challenges to CCGs in particular. Within an overall settlement for the year, which is by any standards exceptionally tight in terms of real purchasing power, once you strip out population growth, inflation, and the very significant changes to pension charges that we had to cope with in 16-17. So in that context, the need to create a risk reserve of 800 million to cover off risks within both the commissioning position and the provider sectors has substantially increased the level of commissioner efficiencies required from 1.9 billion of efficiency achieved last year to 3.1 billion that we've set out in this year's plans, with most of that increase coming in the CCG sector. To state the blindingly obvious, this is a big ask, and it's great that most CCGs have risen brilliantly to the challenge of doing that, and many of them are reporting efficiency gains well in excess of previous years. If you want a flavour for that, just about 80% of CCGs will be delivering more than 2% of commissioner efficiencies this year, compared to less than half of them last year. So there is a marked step up in the delivery of efficiencies by the CCG sector in particular. But it's not really surprising that a number of CCGs are struggling to deliver that ambition in full, leading to a level of risk in their positions which has been pretty consistent at just over 400 million since the very first forecast for the year, and which is progressively translating into overspends recognised in the forecast. That's the second similarity. The third one is that despite the continuing challenges in the CCG sector, the net risk position across the whole of the NHS England group has continued to reduce as a consequence of the mitigating actions that I highlighted back in September, particularly related to the systematic identification and then release to the bottom line of underspends, contingencies and reserves in our central budgets. As a consequence, there's been a progressive improvement in the net risk position across the group, from 454 million, as at the end of the first quarter, to the 373 I reported at our September meeting, the 280 million included in our half-year report, and now the 215 million that you can see as at month 7. I would just counsel you strongly against linear extrapolation of that trend, delightful as it would be and confirming as it would be of my golden month coinage earlier on. That will be a very unwise assumption to make, but at least you can see that over previous months we have been bringing down the net risk across the commissioning sector. And it does indicate that we're delivering on our commitment to take all possible actions to secure a result as close as possible to break even by the end of the year. And all of those numbers, of course, are before allowing for the 800 million reserve I mentioned earlier. That reserve remains intact, and decisions about its use, as between non-recurrent investment and release to the bottom line to offset the impact of deficits across the sector, will be taken early in 2017 in the light of third quarter results. So much for the general introduction to the numbers. Appendix A shows you some more detail on the broadly balanced core forecast position that I've just indicated. The CCG challenges are reflected right across the country in year-to-date overspends averaging 0.7% and affecting 93 CCGs, up from 77 at month 5. Roughly half of those organisations are currently forecasting to recover that position by the end of the year, and you can see that that expected recovery is strongest in the Midlands and East, which has a particularly strong process for intervention where CCGs start to go off track, and has been leading the work across the country on strengthening QIP, or Commissioner Efficiency, delivery. However, as I mentioned earlier, the recovery in Midlands and East and elsewhere is not without risk, and I do anticipate that we'll see further adverse movement in the CCG forecast as the risks highlighted elsewhere in my report continue to crystallise. You can see that specialised commissioning is again expecting to balance its books by the end of the year, despite significant ongoing challenges, particularly in the South region. We do have high levels of confidence in that forecast, partly because of the greatly improved controls that we've put in place around specialised commissioning, and partly because some of the cost risks that we anticipated in central specialised commissioning budgets have not, at least so far, materialised to the extent that we expected. As you can see, there are small underspends forecast in the other direct commissioning budgets. Given the particular focus we have on the challenges and opportunities in GP services, it's perhaps worth just saying that spending on that area within primary care is broadly in line with the significantly increased budget that we set for this year. I've mentioned already the underspends we're actively managing in central budgets. That's been helped by some one-off issues or one-off opportunities, particularly around rates rebates, but it's mainly a question of freezing reserves and capturing underspends as they arise in order to contribute to the bottom line position while protecting the spend on frontline services. And even after allowing for the oddities of Treasury accounting, and I'm afraid there are a few, particularly in relation to provisions, which are reflected in the adjustments towards the bottom of the table, this would give us a clear line of sight to what is effectively a balanced position. I think I've already covered off the very real risks highlighted in paragraphs 13 to 15 of my report. Having completed the intensive review with regional colleagues which I mentioned last time, I can give the board full assurance that everything possible is being done by CCGs themselves and by our teams up and down the country working with them to minimise and mitigate these risks. But I think it's reasonable to assume that our range of likely delivery lies between the break-even forecast that I've presented to you and the roundabout 220 risk-adjusted overspend position indicated in the risk part of the report. And when you combine that range with the 800 million reserve I mentioned at the start, that gives us the potential to contribute a substantial net underspend to the overall NHS position, should that be required to offset a deficit in the provider sector. I have to say that whilst final decisions have yet to be made on that score, it seems highly likely that the bulk of that underspend will be needed in the light of a planned provider deficit of 580 million and a half-year forecast by NHS improvement after allowing for full deployment of the 1.8 billion sustainability funding of 669 million. So far, at least, the actions announced in the so-called reset document earlier in the year, and in particular the initiative to bear down on what had been rapidly growing agency spend and the work with the first two cohorts of trusts in special measures, have helped to contain the risks in the provider sector, but they've not had the impact of reducing the deficit towards the 250 million, which NHSI signalled as its ambition for the year. I mentioned last time that speculation about additional funding for the NHS was misplaced, and the autumn statement has of course reconfirmed that. The board is also aware, I know, that the department's already committed all of its available resources to the allocation provided in the mandate. So the NHS very much needs to stand on its own 2 feet this year. I can assure the board that we're playing our full part in that, and I'd want to put on record, really, as my conclusion of this report, the enormous commitment and admirable resilience which commissioning organisations across the country are demonstrating in tackling simultaneously the massive operational and financial challenges that we've been setting out in the last 2 reports, in a year that was always going to be exceptionally testing and is very much living up to our expectations in that respect. And at the same time, engaging with the very exciting but no less challenging agenda of planning, long, medium and short term, for sustainability and transformation, which we discussed earlier in the agenda. On which note, I commend the report to the board, and as always, look forward to your contributions on any of the topics that I've covered.
Paul, thank you very much for that report. Let me invite contributions, comments from around the directors. No?
I suppose I
Joanne.
would just like thank you to endorse Paul's final comment actually,
Hmm.
and you know, recognise the efforts that are going on in clinical commissioning groups that are contributing to these numbers, which look not as frightening as they might be.
I think we would all concur with that, whilst understanding that this is held together, and it's quite a fragile situation that we find ourselves in. And I would add also commendation to Paul and his team. I think it's an extraordinary amount of work that results in such clarity of exposition, but behind that is a huge complexity of operation. So thank you, Paul.